Hello everyone, I'm Judd,
And I'm Kazi.
and this is the TankNSpank guide to Kurog Grimtotem on normal and heroic difficulty.
We'll start off with our normal disclaimer that this is information coming from the beta. Information here likely will change, and if and when it does, we'll update this guide or issue new.
Jumping into the guide, Kurog is listed in the dungeon journal as the 6th boss of the raid and is one of the End Wing bosses. The encounter area is spread into 4 quadrants. Each quadrant has an elemental altar associated with it. As you drag the boss into a quadrant, he gains the abilities associated with that altar. The longer the boss is in each quadrant, he gains elemental stacks that increase the power of his abilities for that altar. These stacks last the entirety of the fight. Each time you drag Kurog to a new quadrant, he also inflicts Elemental Shift, dealing damage to all raid members, leaving a debuff that increases the damage you take from Elemental Shift. This means you'll want to keep Kurog in the same quadrant for at least 40 seconds. The main tank ability to deal with for this fight is Sundering Strike. Kurog targets the tank with a frontal cleave, dealing damage and knocking back anyone hit. You'll taunt on 1 stack. This ability sometimes overlaps with other abilities that he's doing that you'll want to move out of. Generally speaking, it's better to actually get hit by these abilities and make sure that you aim the Sundering Strike away from the group. On the beta at least, the boss would swap the target of his spell if he taunted mid-cast. Make sure to wait until the cast is completely done before you taunt.
Let's talk then about each of the altars. First up is the Earth Altar. While attuned to the Earth Altar, Kurog will cast Erupting Bedrock. Simply move out of this large circle. He'll also cast Seismic Rupture, which deals damage to anyone standing in it and summons a few adds. The adds stack a debuff that causes the tank to take additional physical damage, but this wasn't anything that required a tank swap. On Heroic, Kurog also casts Enveloping Earth. Kurog targets several players, dealing damage to them and placing a healing absorb on them. In a 16-person raid, this was always 4 people, and it always chose DPS. Then we have the Fire Altar. While attuned here, Kurog casts Magma Burst. These are just large pools of lava on the ground that you need to move out of. He also casts Searing Carnage. He targets random players and throws fire at their location every second for 5 seconds. These players should kite slowly out of the fire. On Heroic, he also casts Molten Rupture, which is just another set of swirls to dodge.
While attuned to the Frost Altar, Kurog casts Biting Chill, which is just a damage over time debuff. He also casts Absolute Zero on 2 players. After a short time, these players are hit by chunks of ice, receiving large damage split between anyone in the circle. If you are hit by both circles, however, you become frozen solid. Players targeted with these abilities can use immunities, but you can't use immunities to soak both circles. On Heroic, Kurog also casts Frigid Torrent, which unleashes a series of frozen orbs that players need to dodge or else be stunned for 6 seconds.
When the boss reaches 66 and 33% of health, he'll run to the center of the room. He takes 99% reduced damage there. He then summons 2 adds that you have to kill in order to make the boss re-enter the fight. At 66%, he will summon the adds corresponding to whichever 2 debuffs he has the most stacks of. So, if you tanked him near the Fire and Frost altars in the first phase 1, he will spawn the Fire and Frost adds first. At 33%, he will summon the other 2 adds he hasn't summoned yet. While these adds are alive, they'll gain a stacking debuff according to their type, and at the end of the phase, they'll transfer that debuff to the boss, increasing his stacks.
The Earth add, the Tectonic Crusher, casts Ground Shatter, which puts circles around every player, requiring them to spread, dealing damage. He also casts Violent Upheaval, which just generates a bunch of brown swirls to dodge. His auto attacks are supposed to place a stacking debuff on the tank, increasing their physical damage taking, but this was not working during testing. The Fire add, the Blazing Fiend, spawns lava pools when it's attacked. These pools deal damage to any players in them and occasionally spawn Smoldering Hellions. These Hellions cast flame bolts at random players which can be interrupted.
The Frost add, the Frozen Destroyer, casts Frostbind, which deals damage and slows, but this can and should be interrupted. Its much more disruptive ability is Freezing Tempest, which deals a decent amount of damage each second to all players within 10 yards, and absolutely massive damage to anyone further away. Stack in the circle and be sure to have healing cooldowns ready for this. Finally, the Lightning add, the Thundering Tempest. dashes randomly around the room, generally being a pain in the ass. It also casts Lethal Current at a nearby player, causing them to do damage to nearby allies. That player just needs to move out of the group.
Once the last ads die and the boss is below 33% health, he casts all of his abilities from phase 1 faster. He also has significantly more stacks from each altar that you've dealt with, so he'll be dealing a lot more damage. At this point, you'll just tank him wherever your group feels most comfortable dealing with the mechanics. Lust here and burn. Generally speaking, we'd recommend starting by tanking the boss in the fire or frost area to start, and then, after you get 2 stacks, move him into the other one of those for the remainder of the time it takes to get his health down to 66%. This will ensure you deal with the fire and frost ads in the first intermission. The frost ad, which requires you to stack, can have some real anti-synergy with both the lightning and the earth ads that require you to spread.
So, what did you think of the boss?
I really like the idea of the fight. I like the choose your own adventure. You can pick which altars you want to start in, you can pick which mechanics you want to deal with. There's also ramping damage, so if one quadrant you feel like is easier to handle, for instance, the fire one, which is mainly just a lot of dodging, you can keep him in there longer.
So when I jumped into this fight, it felt to me a lot like the 9, where there's a ton of different abilities. So based on where you are, he's got, 12, 15, 18 abilities that he could be casting throughout this fight. Having said that, like the 9, none of these abilities felt super impactful. Yes, you had to deal with the soak. Yes, you had to deal with different things, but none of it was anything that made the fight extremely difficult. And with the 9, it being the third boss in the encounter, when it was tuned so that those abilities didn't deal much damage, it made sense because it was such an early boss. This is going to be one of the last bosses that you're fighting before moving on to the kind of the penultimate boss and the last boss. So I think the expectation is that the difficulty is a little bit higher here, but if these abilities continue to be tuned so that they're almost forgettable, I think that could be a problem for this fight.
Yeah, it did feel like when we were testing, like we figured out real quick that the fire is just kind of the spread area. Don't stand in stuff. He's going to put swirlies on the ground. You have to dodge. Then he does another ability that's essentially just things you need to dodge. And then he does another ability that, oh yeah, he puts patches on the ground. Guess what? You need to dodge them. Um, Definitely found that the storm one was one of the more difficult. The 4 debuffs that went out, and it's possible this wasn't really working as intended. At the time, it was dealing a lot of damage, so we were actually having to swap people um, instead of having one just being able to buddy up and have one person soak the entire debuff. You actually had to at some point swap somebody out or use an off tank. I know when I was off tanking, I was running between all 4 of them trying to soak stacks off that just to make sure people weren't dying. So there's a lot of damage going out. I don't know if that's intended to be tuned that way. It would be kind of interesting if it is, because if the soaks are really impactful, doing a lot of damage, you're going to have your raid properly split in 2 groups. For instance, during the frost phase, there's 2 big soaks that go out that can't overlap. Um, if you need on a 10-person raid, if you need to have 5 and 5 soaking that, it makes it a much bigger deal than if you just need 3 people in there. That really comes down to the tuning.
Yeah, the tuning seemed to be off a couple of times. Like the lightning ability was dealing about 10 times as much damage as the Dungeon Journal said it did. So that leaves the question. That specific one was probably the worst. That and then the Frost Elementals, the Frost Adds ability was hitting like an absolute truck.
Yeah, yeah. During the channel part, everyone has to stack up on. Actually, similar to the 9, where you had one where you get pulled in and you need to stay out of, and then you had one where you get pushed out and you need to go into. The Frost Elemental has a similar ability where everyone needs to stack up within 10 yards of him. Anyone outside of that is basically just dies. When you're fighting 2 ads at a time, that's 2 ads at a time. That's where you're finding that anti synergy. Where, well, if I have the Earth Elemental with the Frost Elemental, I can't stack up and also be spread at the same time. You're just going to die. So that's where some of the strategy comes in, as which order you're going to pick the ads. Again, we're recommending right now where it sits dealing with fire and frost together, because for fire you do not have to stack up or spread. You just have to dodge. One other thing talking about the ads as well is we were able to, for instance, when we get fire and frost in the first phase, we were able to burn down the frost ad before he cast his main ability that you need to stack up for. I don't know if it's going to be tuned that way or intended, or if it's intended to be tuned that way, but that could get pretty interesting if you can actually deal with one ad, burn him down before we even see an ability. It will make that phase much easier.
Yeah, and once you get into the final phase, you kind of have a choice of where exactly you want to tank the boss. He's going to have a lot of stacks. He's because you have all the stacks from when you were fighting in that altar, but also from the ads adding those stacks. We found that we could pretty much stay in the Earth altar the entire time, where the only real ramping damage is tank damage. And if you ever have the choice between ramping raid damage and ramping tank damage, the tanks are almost always the better option. So we spent the vast majority of that final phase just in the Earth altar, and it seemed like the increased damage was really not an issue at all.
Another healthy addition to that is he was spawning 4 ads during that. So Lust plus 4 ads, possible some funnel damage in there. The ads didn't do much. They smacked the tank, and yeah, they are supposed to put a debuff for tanking increased physical damage, but if your tanks can live it, that's free damage for any classes that are going to do good funnel going into this expansion.
Aesthetically, I thought that the fight encounter was really cool. The fact that his appearance changes so dramatically when you go from altar to altar. And also, even something like his Sundering Strike, his big tank ability, changes colors depending on what altar you're in. It definitely made it so that each of the altars felt different, or at least looked different, and felt like it was something that was a pretty cool effect overall.
Yeah, and he's also in a full set of Shaman tier gear, so looks great. That's going to do it for this guide. Thanks everyone for watching. Please like and subscribe to the video. We look forward to putting out more guides as we move on through the raid.